February 9, 1944, northern France. The airfield near Beauvais lay under a dull sheet of frozen mist. Frost clung to the wings of idle aircraft like thin armor, and every sound carried. A clank of metal, a boot on gravel, the sigh of a wind that refused to rise. Along the perimeter, rows of fuel drums stood motionless, each one sweating through a film of ice. Inside the cockpit of a battered P-47 Thunderbolt, Lieutenant Frank Harlow waited. His gloves were stiff with cold. The right engine refused to ignite. Coughing, faltering, dying again with a muted groan that echoed inside the canopy. He could feel the faint vibration of other machines around him. Generators humming, distant carts rolling, ground crews murmuring through scarves. Yet inside the cockpit, only the dead rhythm of a misfiring cylinder filled the air. He checked his instruments. The compass glass was cracked. The altimeter needle trembled in place. Through the haze beyond the airfield fence, faint silhouettes moved. The angular outlines of Luftwaffe Bf-110s, lining up for takeoff less than a mile away. They looked spectral through the mist, engines warming with low growls that merged into a single metallic thrum. Headquarters' directive had been clear. Crippled aircraft were to be abandoned. Never risk capture. Never risk losing the machine. Yet Harlow's eyes stayed fixed on the thin black runway stretching toward the east. The same path the Germans would soon use to climb into the gray morning. He glanced at the checklist, then at his own reflection in the cracked gauge. He knew the numbers: distance, wind direction, estimated intercept times. If those interceptors launched now, the bomber stream assembling over the channel would be unguarded for 13 minutes. That was enough for the Germans to reach altitude, enough to tear apart 2, maybe 3 formations. He reached for the ignition again, holding it longer this time. The engine coughed, spat flame, caught for 3 seconds, then died. Silence returned, heavy and total. Somewhere to his left, a mechanic shouted, but the words vanished into fog. Harlow looked once more toward the horizon. The mist was beginning to thin, revealing the pale outlines of hangars and the faint orange flicker of German exhausts. Time was narrowing. He could bail out. He could save himself. But the thought felt mechanical, detached from instinct. His left engine still worked. Weak, uneven, but alive. He knew that if he could bring the throttle forward, even on one engine, he might push the Thunderbolt across the runway just as the enemy's first pair accelerated. A crippled aircraft across their path could block takeoff, stall their entire sequence. It was a desperate idea, built from fragments of training and impulse. He exhaled slowly. Frost clouded the canopy, turning the world into a dull blur. He eased the throttle forward, and the aircraft lurched, wheels grinding over frozen dirt. The sound was raw, like steel dragged across gravel. The left propeller clawed the air, coughing smoke. The right one hung motionless. The plane moved, barely, toward the runway lights. Ahead, the German aircraft were rolling. He could see the faint glimmer of their navigation lamps, the rhythmic pulse of engines spooling to full thrust. Harlow pushed harder. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently, tail fishtailing across the ice. Alarms flickered. Oil pressure, temperature, magneto fault. But the plane kept crawling. Every meter forward was a sentence written in machine strain. Behind him, the mist swallowed the base. Ahead, the war's machinery came into focus. Enemy fighters accelerating, ground crew running, signal flares rising. For one suspended moment, both forces shared the same air. The living and the doomed locked in a single industrial rhythm. The manual said abandon. The system demanded preservation. But at 0542, Lieutenant Frank Harlow advanced a crippled fighter toward an enemy runway, alone inside a noise that was half engine, half heartbeat. Before the war, Frank Harlow's world was measured in decimals and tolerances. In Wichita, Kansas, The noise of turbine testing bays had been his daily weather. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and acetone, the language of precision. He had tuned aircraft turbines for the Republic Aviation subcontractors, his hands moving with the patience of an instrument maker. His satisfaction came not from flight, but from symmetry, the balance between sound and motion, friction and temperature. A propeller's hum told him everything he needed to know about trust. That discipline had once been enough to define him. Among pilots, his caution became legend. He was the one who calculated fuel weight down to the half-gallon, the one who cleaned his oxygen mask even after routine patrols. To his squadron, it was ritual bordering on superstition. They joked that he flew by math, not instinct. Yet, for Harlow, the habit of control was not pride. It was defense. Each screw tightened, each gauge polished, was a small victory against uncertainty. Machines, unlike men, did not lie. They failed in patterns, and as long as he could read those patterns, he believed he could survive them. War, however, had no pattern. By 1944, even the most meticulous systems bled through their seams. Fuel convoys stalled in frozen mud, bearings cracked from overuse. The chain of precision that began in factories ended in chaos, scattered across snowfields and crash sites. Harlow had seen friends vanish into those margins, swallowed by weather or miscalculation. He recorded each loss in a small notebook, never with words of grief, only with numbers, altitude, pressure, engine hours. It was his quiet rebellion against disorder, a belief that statistics could shield him from emotion. But that February morning over northern France, the balance he lived by began to fracture. Smoke from distant depots curled above the tree line, drifting toward the airfield like a slow-moving tide. The hum of machinery that usually steadied him, the synchronized pulse of engines warming, compressors engaging, now sounded uneven, like a system breathing its last. His own aircraft sat crippled on the frost, a single propeller spinning in lazy defiance. For the first time, the math failed him. Every number pointed toward retreat. Every checklist ended in surrender. He looked over his instruments, each dial alive but meaningless. The compass stuttered. The manifold gauge quivered. Beneath the numbers was silence. The kind of silence that warns of something about to break. His training said to eject. His manuals, written by men who had never felt the weight of failure in their hands, called it protocol. But Harlow had lived too long among machines to mistake procedure for truth. He knew when an engine was dying, and when it still had one last motion left in it. There was an industrial certainty in his defiance. To him, the aircraft was not a tool, but a system fighting entropy, a fragment of order surrounded by collapse. He had spent years ensuring engines outlasted men. Now, in this frozen airfield, he would trust the same principle in reverse, that one man, if disciplined enough, could make a failing machine act with purpose one final time. Harlow wasn't reckless. He was loyal to the pattern he had built his life upon. But on that morning, even loyalty demanded corruption. The rules that had kept him alive would have to be broken to keep others alive. Precision had been his comfort. Now it became his test. The operation had started in darkness. At 02:00 a.m., under the red wash of blackout lamps, the ground crews of the 78th Fighter Group prepared the field like engineers tending a living engine. The air hung thick with exhaust fumes and frost. Tanker rail cars hissed softly as fuel lines were coupled to the waiting thunderbolts. Each drum emptied with a rhythmic pulse. Gallons of aviation fuel measured, recorded, and signed off in ledgers that ran as precise as clockwork. Men moved between the aircraft without words, guided by habit. Harlow had always admired that silence, not absence of communication, but its perfection. In that hour before dawn, the entire base operated like a synchronized mechanism, an organism of valves, pumps, and steel wings breathing in unison. To Harlow, this was faith made mechanical. The hiss of nitrogen, the metallic click of loading belts through feed trays, the hum of electric carts, all formed a kind of liturgy. Each sound verified order. Each action reaffirmed that chaos could be confined, organized, conquered through precision. Pilots became parts within the same machinery, replaceable, necessary, unseen. Their purpose was to feed the larger rhythm, not to question it. The system didn't demand courage. It demanded consistency. That was its strength and its trap. When the first formation lifted into the air, it did so with the seamless grace of a production line. One plane every 40 seconds. The noise rose, flattened, and then faded into the mist as hundreds of engines merged into a single tone, a continental hum stretching from England to occupied France. Above that rhythm moved the bombers, slow, heavy, deliberate. Below them, fighter escorts like Harlow's P-47s served as the rotating cogs, circling, covering, refueling, returning. It was a system designed to erase individual will. Everything depended on schedule, on fuel, on timing. By 4:14 a.m., the first combat reports were already transmitting across the network. Radio frequencies hummed with coded bursts. Weather units updated crosswinds. Maintenance rosters confirmed readiness for recovery cycles. Somewhere inside this machinery of war, Harlow found a strange peace. Machines did not panic. They only failed when asked to do something they were not built to perform. But by dawn, the pattern broke. The runway that had once glowed with coordinated activity was now streaked with black smoke from a depot strike nearby. Half the communications tower had lost power. The generator cables lay coiled and frozen in slush. The fueling teams, once moving in measured rhythm, were now silhouettes shouting through static. And Harlow's Thunderbolt, the same aircraft that had once been another flawless gear in the Allied mechanism, stood crippled, its right engine silent. He had been left outside the circuit, watching the machine continue without him. He tried the radio. Only a low hum replied. The relay was gone. Ground control couldn't hear him, and command couldn't adjust their timetable for a single failing unit. The mission clock advanced without hesitation. Precision, once sacred, became merciless. The convoy of bombers above would expect their escort at exact intervals. 06 hours, 06:20, 06:40, a chain that could not pause. The system he trusted most had no space for delay. For Harlow, that realization was heavier than fear. The machine he had worshipped, maintained, and defended had no conscience, only efficiency. It continued its rhythm even as its smallest parts faltered. To save the convoy, someone would have to disrupt it, jam the gear, delay the enemy, fracture the pattern. Everything he had learned urged against it. Every order reinforced obedience to the timetable. But in the fog of that French airfield, surrounded by the mechanical remains of a perfect system cracking under real weather, one truth became visible. No machine survives without a man willing to break it once. He looked at the gauges again. Oil pressure dipping, fuel needle trembling at half. His life was now a decimal on a chart that no one would read until after the sortie ended. He pressed the ignition a final time. The left engine caught. Smoke rose in uneven plumes, thick and black. The aircraft lurched forward a few inches, not smooth, not planned, but alive. Harlow had spent his career trusting systems. Now he would test what happened when one gear refused to turn as instructed. The war's strength lay in its machinery, but victory often began with the sound of something misfiring on purpose. Would you have broken the system? The morning had sharpened into a thin, metallic gray. Harlow's Thunderbolt drifted low across the French countryside, its lone engine stuttering against the cold. The altimeter needle trembled between digits, refusing to settle. Beneath him, frost-glazed fields stretched to the horizon, their furrows marked by the remnants of convoy tracks. The mist that had blanketed the airfield at dawn now clung to the earth in shreds, rising and folding like slow smoke. From above, the war looked almost paused, but the stillness was deceptive. Through breaks in the fog, Harlow caught glimpses of the German airfield. A row of trucks moved in deliberate sequence, their exhausts coiling upward like faint gray ribbons. Crews gathered near the fuel lines. Men in dark coats walked briskly between hangars, shoulders squared against the cold. It was not chaos yet, it was organization. He could feel the rhythm of readiness. The Luftwaffe was waking. His left engine coughed once, then steadied. The sound of each rotation filled the cockpit, rhythmic but strained. He adjusted trim and checked the manifold pressure. Readings fluctuated, as though the machine itself were hesitating, aware of its own fragility. Harlow's gloves were stiff, his breath fogging against the canopy glass. He knew he shouldn't be here. His escort unit had already climbed westward, regrouping toward the channel. Radio contact was dead. The Allied network, usually alive with clipped transmissions and coded affirmations, had gone silent. Silence was never neutral in war. It was the absence that preceded motion. He banked slowly, keeping his distance. The mist rolled beneath him like a fading tide, revealing more of the runway. Two figures sprinted toward the parked BF-110s. Another man waved a signal flag, red, then white, patterns he recognized from his training charts. The sequence meant prepare for launch. He could almost hear the static of ground radios aligning frequencies, even though his own set produced nothing but a dull hum. The system, the network of coordination he trusted, was no longer guiding him. He circled again, lower this time. The altimeter needle dipped below 500 feet. He could smell burning oil through the cabin vent. Faint, acrid, mechanical. His engine vibrated with uneven rhythm, like a machine trying to resist its own exhaustion. Each vibration felt like an argument: follow procedure or trust perception. Below, the Germans worked with measured urgency. Fuel drums were rolled forward. Mechanics fastened cowl panels, their movements practiced, synchronized. The distant whine of an engine starter echoed faintly through the air, the unmistakable pitch of twin props preparing for ignition. In another minute, those aircraft would rise. Harlow's orders had been explicit. Damaged units were to withdraw over friendly territory. No engagement, no deviation. The policy was clear. Preserve the pilot. Preserve the machine. He had recited it himself during briefing hours before, but as he watched the airfield stir, each second became heavier. He could not tell if the trembling in his hands came from the cold or from the pressure of stillness. The radio sputtered once, a fragment of static, a broken syllable, then fell silent again. No instructions, no confirmation. The system that managed hundreds of missions with industrial precision had gone quiet in the moment that required it most. And in that quiet, Harlow understood. Silence could kill more effectively than enemy fire. He looked back once more. The Luftwaffe crews were now moving with certainty. Black crosses glinted faintly through the fog. One aircraft rolled from its bay. Another followed. The engine notes multiplied. Low, coordinated, disciplined. The German airfield had become a living mechanism, every part fulfilling its role with cold precision. Harlow throttled slightly, feeling the torque strain through the damaged frame. The sky ahead remained empty, unclaimed. He hovered between compliance and consequence, between the safety of orders and the instinct of observation. Below him, the system he had trusted, both allied and enemy, resumed its perfect rhythm. But the silence surrounding him was no longer absence. It was instruction. The question was simple and impossible to escape. The aircraft trembled in its own exhaustion. Harlow's gloved hand steadied the throttle as if holding a pulse. The left engine ran unevenly, coughing through thick black fumes that streaked the fuselage. He kept one eye on the altimeter, 400 feet and falling slowly. Fuel at 8%. The gauge needle shook like a nerve. Beneath the fog, the German airfield grew sharper, lines of aircraft forming across the frost. He could see the outlines of the twin-engine Bf-110s beginning their taxi, their propellers glinting under the dim morning haze. They were minutes from liftoff. The Allied manual had no clause for this. Every directive emphasized survival over sacrifice. No pilot was to destroy his aircraft deliberately. The system depended on continuity, machines preserved, data logged, pilots recycled into the next operation. The doctrine of war had evolved into one of preservation. Yet what Harlow saw below ignored that logic. The Luftwaffe's runway glowed with ignition sparks and the thin white breath of engines coming alive. They were seconds from joining the bomber routes that stretched west across the channel. Routes filled with returning aircraft low on fuel, exposed, unguarded. For a moment, the system around him dissolved into static. The chain of command, the pre-written codes, the invisible structure of wartime discipline, all of it faded behind the simple, raw clarity of what was happening below. He felt the old technician in him searching for patterns, evaluating pressure, time, and probability. Every calculation returned the same conclusion. There was no time for interception, no other Allied unit in range. The only variable left was him. One damaged aircraft, one final maneuver. He flattened the throttle, feeling the control stick vibrate against his palm. The P-47 lurched forward, airframe creaking under torque. His vision narrowed to the pale ribbon of runway, faintly visible through mist. The left engine screamed, dragging the crippled weight through the air. The right propeller, dead since dawn, windmilled in resistance. He leveled the nose, aligning the path of descent with the row of German fighters accelerating below. For a few seconds, his mind flickered through details. The faint flicker of the prop arc, the thin lines of exhaust drifting skyward, the glint of frost melting on his canopy. Each image burned itself into precision. Then came the whisper, the voice every pilot carried, the one that surfaces when reason collapses. You're already dead. It wasn't defiance. It was recognition. The math had already ended. Harlow adjusted trim once, steadying the aircraft. Below, the first German plane lifted its tail. Men scattered along the tarmac, their silhouettes breaking from formation. He could see them pointing upward, unsure whether he was crashing or attacking. His instruments flickered red. Fuel critical. Oil pressure falling. Coolant at threshold. Still, the machine obeyed. Metal against wind. Weight against gravity. In the seconds before contact, Harlow felt no surge of fear, only mechanical focus. An engineer finishing a calculation he had already solved. The logic was pure, stripped of rank or reward. If he veered away, the system would continue. Efficient, unfeeling, and vulnerable. If he stayed the course, he might fracture it. Not to destroy it, but to preserve what it protected. He pushed the throttle until it stopped responding. The P-47 roared downward, closing the gap in a low, guttural tone that swallowed the fog. One German aircraft lifted off. Another halted abruptly. Harlow's final sight was the silver trail of runway ahead. A single, perfect line of purpose cutting through chaos. There were no reports of gunfire. No confirmed transmission. Only a plume of smoke rising from the eastern edge of the airfield, merging with the clouds at 5:46. Sicrium in the mission logs filed later. The notation was brief. One aircraft lost. Enemy runway rendered inoperative. The system moved on. The bombers reached home. And somewhere between protocol and instinct, a man who once trusted decimals placed his faith in collision. Would you have followed the manual or the moment? At 05:49 a.m., Lieutenant Frank Harlow eased the Thunderbolt's nose downward. The left engine wailed under strain, its cylinders vibrating against the cold air. Frost lifted from the wings in small bursts, scattering like white dust behind him. The altimeter needle spun down through the numbers. Beneath the fog, the airfield widened. Gray hangars, fuel trucks, men running in thin silhouettes. A single BF-110 rolled forward from its line, its tail lifting as the engines roared alive. The ground seemed to pull him in. The stick trembled. The Thunderbolt felt heavier than it ever had, like a machine resisting its own intent. Harlow pressed his boots against the rudder pedals, steadying the descent. The engine's cough broke into a scream, metal plates vibrating, gauges rattling in protest. He kept one hand firm on the throttle, the other brushing the cracked compass glass as if to steady it too. At 300 feet, the world narrowed into fragments. Exhaust trails, the shimmer of spilled fuel, the faint glint of steel helmets on the tarmac. He no longer saw the horizon, only motion. He cut power. The sound vanished instantly. What remained was the pressure, air rushing past metal, the hollow weight of silence filling the cockpit. Frost formed again on the inside of the canopy. His breath condensed in clouds that floated between him and the world outside. The runway rose fast now. At 200 feet, he could see the fuel drums rolling, men diving for cover, and the first German plane breaking formation, tail high, propellers clawing at fog. The machine beneath him shook violently, every bolt and joint howling through vibration. The controls no longer answered. But still, the Thunderbolt held its line. Impact came without sound. Just a single moment where motion folded into light. The explosion muted itself against the fog, swallowed by air dense with fuel and smoke. Fire moved outward like a slow tide, crawling across the runway. Tires burned, tanks ruptured, metal warped into molten shapes that no longer resembled aircraft. Witnesses on the far perimeter said they heard only one noise, the echo of a descending engine followed by nothing. No gunfire, no second pass. Just the abrupt punctuation of silence. The German ground crews spent hours afterward dragging wreckage from the tarmac. The heat warped their tools. By dawn, the airfield was unusable, cratered, smoking, slick with fuel that burned in small, stubborn patches. The first interception wave, scheduled for 5:52 m.m., never launched. The Allied bomber groups crossed safely into the Channel corridor 10 minutes later. No reports of pursuit, no sign of interception. In the official record, the notation was simple: aircraft lost. Cause unknown. No commendation followed. No radio mention. Within the larger mechanism of war, the act was reduced to data. One entry on a maintenance ledger. One more line in a logistics summary. The system acknowledged the loss, but not the reason. For the ground crews who rebuilt the field days later, the crater was just another obstacle to fill and pave. For the bombers that made it home that morning, it was nothing more than clear air and an open path. But for one man inside a falling machine, the war had turned on the decision to disobey, not out of defiance, but out of faith in instinct when the system could no longer calculate. The field was quiet by 07828 RCM. Only the frost remained, melting over broken concrete and twisted steel. The machine had done its work. The man had disappeared inside it. 10 minutes later, 40 miles north, a formation of B-17s moved through open sky. The bombers flew in tight geometry, engines droning in slow unison. Their flight path crossed the gray expanse of northern France. Unopposed, uninterrupted. Radio operators reported calm frequencies. No radar pings, no incoming fighters. For the first time in weeks, the sky held no trace of interception. Ground control at the Allied command post marked the anomaly. German response times had fractured. Half their intercept units failed to launch. Controllers listened for Luftwaffe chatter, but the bands remained quiet. Broken static, no coordination. At 06:02 a.m., the first wave of B-17s dropped ordnance on railway yards near Amiens, without a single enemy contact. Bombardiers described it later as strangely silent. No flak coordination. No fighters in pursuit. Above the channel, the air traffic spacing held perfect. Convoys returned on schedule. No deviation, no loss. The war's rhythm, so often dictated by attrition and mechanical failure, had, for one morning, turned in their favor. None aboard the bombers knew why. In their radio exchanges, a single question repeated among squadrons. What happened to Blue 2? It was asked casually at first, then logged formally by wing operations. Blue 2 had gone silent 30 minutes before. No distress call, no beacon, just disappearance. The airfield officers assumed a fuel failure over occupied territory. The record was filed under presumed lost. What none of them saw was the smoke still rising from Beauvais. There, the frozen tarmac glowed faintly through the fog, cracked, burning, and scattered with twisted metal. Among the wreckage, engines still hissed where ice met fire. The fuel that once fed the Luftwaffe's morning sortie now burned against its own aircraft. Ground crews stood among the debris, unsure whether they had been attacked or sabotaged by their own system. By the time reconnaissance passed over 2 days later, the scene was unremarkable. A scar across concrete, partially repaired, half covered with snow. The report labeled it a runway obstruction. The cause was never investigated beyond routine repair. The name of the pilot was never attached to the effect. Weeks passed. The bombers that survived that morning flew again and again. Missions catalogued, fuel logged, names rotated. None of them knew that one pilot's final descent had interrupted the Luftwaffe's strike window by 13 minutes, long enough to divert an entire intercept command. In the official systems, there was no connection. One column listed aircraft lost. Another recorded enemy response delayed. The war's data aligned but never told the story. Industrial wars often forget the human element inside their machinery. Systems remember outcomes, not origins. A cracked runway becomes a statistic. A missing pilot becomes a number. And yet, in that unseen equation, one man's decision altered the day's arithmetic of survival. When the bombers landed in England hours later, they taxied into neat rows under steady rain. Engines cooled. Ground crews refueled. Pilots climbed down, stretching, unaware of the silence they had flown through. A silence bought by a single act no one would ever confirm. The reports from that morning end with a line. Mission successful. Minimal resistance encountered. Nothing more. The war moved forward. The system repaired itself. The crater was filled. The name faded. At Debden Airfield, the morning returned to routine. The hangar doors opened just after dawn, spilling weak English light across concrete still wet from overnight rain. The air smelled of oil, canvas, and ground fuel, the scent of normal operations. Inside the debrief hut, condensation gathered on the windows, tracing lines down the glass. A clerk in uniform flipped through casualty reports, reading names in a monotone rhythm. When he reached the letter H, he stopped briefly, then read without pause. Lieutenant Frank Harlow, missing in action. No one responded. The squadron commander nodded once and signed the line. The pen left a faint smear where the ink had mixed with moisture. The folder closed. That was the end of it, officially. The rule book was clear. Deliberate loss of an aircraft was a punishable offense, regardless of outcome. The system depended on discipline, not improvisation. Commanders existed to preserve control, not to justify disobedience. But even here, inside the rigid structure of reports and protocol, everyone knew the facts that didn't fit the page. Luftwaffe sorties from Beauvais had dropped to 0 for 48 hours. The morning raids over the Channel had gone unanswered. The bombers had made it home untouched. The numbers told their own story, even if no one was permitted to write it that way. By afternoon, rumors replaced silence. A mechanic near the briefing tents was the first to say it aloud. He did it on purpose. Others repeated it quietly, while refueling the next line of Thunderbolts. They didn't call it heroism. They didn't call it sacrifice. They called it precision. A man who had measured everything to the decimal had chosen the final calculation himself. In the barracks that night, the crew left his bunk untouched. The gray blanket stayed folded with sharp corners. His flight helmet hung from the bedpost, visor polished, straps aligned. The small ritual of maintenance became language. Bolts tightened more firmly, tools cleaned twice instead of once, logbooks written in steadier handwriting. The silence of the hangar carried meaning. They couldn't record what he'd done, but they could ensure that his machine's lineage continued without error. Elsewhere, in the administrative wing, an operations officer typed the weekly summary. His keystrokes echoed faintly through the corridor. Under the section, Losses and Damage, one sentence carried everything that could be admitted. P-47 aircraft lost over northern France. Cause undetermined. Impact site rendered local airfield inoperable. The phrasing was careful. It told the truth without saying why. The folder was filed under Sortie 2116EB. It joined hundreds of others, stacked and stamped, slowly feeding into the archival system that processed war into paper. That was how bureaucracies preserved victory, through omission. The system recorded events, not intentions. The war machine rewarded efficiency, not instinct. By the next morning, new pilots had already arrived. New aircraft were assigned. Engines were tested, fueled, and rolled toward the runway. The same procedures resumed with the same precision. Only one thing had changed, an unspoken understanding that somewhere beneath the logic of regulations, a single man's decision had protected them all. There were no medals, no citations, just the tightening of bolts on cold metal, the sound of cloth being stretched across a new wing, and the faint hum of a generator restarting the next mission's rhythm. The report never mentioned disobedience. It only recorded the outcome. Would you have signed the line or questioned what it buried? Decades later, the airfield near Beauvais no longer exists. Grass covers the cracked concrete. The wind moves through what was once the main runway, bending tall weeds where aircraft once aligned in symmetry. Farmers plow through the soil each spring, their machinery occasionally striking metal. Small, dull fragments of an engine cowling or the curved frame of a canopy. Children collect the pieces, not knowing what they are. The war has thinned into rumor. No monument marks the spot. No plaque lists the name Harlow, Frank, Lieutenant, U.S. Army Air Forces. The map still shows the shape of the old airfield, faint beneath layers of roads and farmland, but no one visiting would recognize it as a place where systems once converged. Fuel, command, procedure, obedience. Only fragments remain. When the sun catches them at the right angle, shards of cockpit glass reflect light across the soil. Brief as the flash of a signal flare, in military archives, his name appears only once more. A brief reference under a maintenance ledger dated February 1944. Aircraft 221B, lost over northern France. Nothing follows. No annotation. The records were efficient in their silence. Among historians, his story exists only as a footnote, a blank space in formation reports. But in flight academies and tactical courses, the incident is still used as a question. When does obedience become failure? The manuals phrase it as a hypothetical, stripped of names and units. A pilot deviates from orders, sacrifices his aircraft to disrupt the enemy. Is this error or execution? The answers remain divided. Some call it insubordination. Others call it precision. Machines are designed to remove uncertainty. Systems exist to eliminate instinct. But wars, like the machines that fight them, depend on the quiet errors that no manual can anticipate. Harlow's final act was not defiance for glory. It was calibration, the alignment of human judgment with mechanical necessity. In the charts of efficiency, his dive reads as a malfunction. In the logic of survival, It reads as correction. Every few years, a veteran or an aviation enthusiast revisits the coordinates. They bring metal detectors, notebooks, sometimes small flags. The soil gives back tiny offerings, rivets, scraps of alloy, a melted identification plate. Nothing enough to rebuild the story, only enough to confirm it happened. One engineer who studied the site in the 1970s wrote in his field notes, "This is not debris. It is residue of precision. Fragments arranged by intent, not chance." He was right. Even in ruin, the site follows a pattern. The crater aligns perfectly with the runway's center line. The mark of a dive measured, not accidental. Time converts all systems to silence. The engines stop, the records yellow, the memory dissolves. Yet in that silence lies a form of control, the kind that holds order by removing it. Harlow didn't destroy the system. He paused it long enough for others to continue. The absence he left behind became its own kind of precision. Absence of enemy, absence of failure, absence of sound. The field today is quiet. Birds cross the open space where exhaust once burned the air. The soil remembers what the archives do not. The moment a man became the final instrument of the machine he served.